Hi, this is Tom Nelson. I thought it was time for me to do a video talking about how I became a climate skeptic and then showing you why everyone should be a climate skeptic. So I'll start with a little story that does not seem related, but trust me, it's very related. Back in 2005, I was just an ordinary person who tended to believe scientific claims that were in the paper. I thought scientists know better than us. They must have studied these issues and they must be right. But in 2005, Cornell University came out with this astounding paper that said that they had rediscovered the ivory-billed woodpecker, which had been extinct for decades. They had 17 authors on this paper and they had a video, and all the experts believed it. There was a grand announcement, and for a while I believed it. But as a bird watcher, I decided to check into that evidence for myself. And it fell apart instantly as soon as I checked into it. You look at the actual video, it was extremely blurry. It could have been anything. They had some eyewitness accounts that were not very good accounts. They had some noises in the woods, and they had a 6-pixel ivory bill. So this extinct bird, so a piece of proof that they had found this extinct bird was 6 pixels of data, which is a total farce. So I started a blog back then, and a lot of other amateur bird watchers and other amateurs joined in, and they looked at the evidence for themselves, looked at it from their own perspectives. And it was a very good clearinghouse, for a good place for people to go and share their analysis of the evidence. And eventually the excitement waned as people realized they had not discovered the ivory bill. By the way, that peer-reviewed paper is still out there unretracted to this day. Anyway, Jack Hitt of the New York Times ended up writing an excellent book called A Bunch of Amateurs, about how amateurs, people who are not professionals, can analyze data for themselves, and they can debunk scientific claims. He devoted a whole chapter in that book to the debunking we did of the ivory-billed claims around 2005 or so. That was very satisfying for me. Then, at some point, a meteorologist who was involved in the ivory-billed debate wrote me a long email saying there's a lot of reasons why that scientific debate is like the climate debate, and he was absolutely right. So that kicked me off into the climate debate, and for the last 15 plus years, I've been involved in that debate. A lot of things are the same. The evidence here in the climate debate is very sketchy, and if you're just an amateur and you look into it for yourself, you can easily poke huge holes into it, even in day one. All you have to do is look at the actual data. All right, my blog is still tomnelson.blogspot.com. If you go there, at the very top of the blog, there are some notes for climate skeptics. I do encourage you to do that because there's all sorts of good stuff there about scientific papers that don't agree with the consensus, and evidence about hurricanes and about polar bears and droughts. All sorts of things are there if you're interested in digging into this. Major assumptions here that warmists tend to make include that the Earth is too hot, there's a climate crisis, etc. There's all these assumptions that completely fall apart if you just dig into the data for yourself. I think most people who do believe they're victims of groupthink. They believe that some other expert has already proved this. I think even climatologists, a lot of them believe that someone else has done the work to prove this. So they believe the assumptions, they have not checked out the assumptions. All right, this is part of my tomnelson.blogspot.com. I list a lot of different papers here, peer-reviewed papers that you can read that do not agree with the climate crisis narrative. I wanted to point out this no consensus part right here. Out of almost 12K climate papers published in a couple decade period there, very few of them, only 0.3%, actually found that greater than half of the warming in that period, of the post-1950 period, was caused by humans. So huge numbers of papers have been published that have something to do with climate. They mention the word climate, but they don't actually involve people digging in to try to see what's caused by humans and what was natural variability. So in this case, just a tiny percentage of them concluded that. You often see that 97% of papers conclude that, but they are adding papers to the consensus. If they don't explicitly say they disagree, then they must agree. And something I like to stress here is that if someone is doing research on something like butterflies, it may be hard to get funding, but if they say they are doing research on the effect of climate change on butterflies, it might be quite a bit easier for them to get funding. So a lot of funding, a lot of papers have been written on that basis where they're really on some other topic unrelated to climate, but the word climate or climate change is in there because it helps to get funding for the paper. And it's easier to get funding if you go along with the narrative. But the bottom line is very few people are actually investigating which or what percentage of current climate changes are caused by humans. All right, let's move on here. This is one of my favorite graphs from the late, great Bob Carter. It's a blue line. Here, this is Greenland over the last 10,000 years or so. The blue line is showing generally decreasing temperatures in Greenland over that time period. The red line at the bottom shows, at least in the last 7,000 years here, it shows generally increasing CO2 during that period. So CO2 was the climate control knob. If you increase CO2 like we did here for thousands of years, you would expect that the temperature over here would also increase. But for that long time period, an increase in CO2 here did not lead to an increase in temperature. Actually, the temperature went down. So that's pretty strong evidence that CO2 isn't the climate control knob. And there are just tons of examples. This is just one example. Clearly, CO2 is not the climate control knob because lots of other things are happening. There's all these other little fluctuations going on here. There's this heating here and this heating here, all the other fluctuations, and it's very hard to determine what actually caused those. The climate is very complex and hard to model. All right, so you might think that heat deaths, if you listen to the propaganda, the number of people killed by heat must be going up, right? Well, that's just not true at all. The Lancet here in 2015 came out with a study saying that actually cold kills 20 times as many people as heat. So clearly cold is more dangerous to people than heat, and that's shown also in this data here, where these blue bars show how many people were killed relatively by cold versus the red bars, how many people were killed by heat. As you look at all these different places, cold is much more dangerous, kills more people than heat. So the whole idea that we would save lives if we could cool the planet just doesn't make any sense. It probably would cost us lives because cold is more dangerous than heat. And warm periods in human history have been called optimums. So over here, next slide, we have a death, or climate-related deaths. And again, if you listen to the propaganda, you would think that the climate's becoming more dangerous and it's killing more people because the storms are getting worse. Absolutely untrue. Climate-related deaths are way down. You see the blue line has plunged since 1920. So it pains me when I see young climate protesters holding up signs saying that you will die of old age, but I will die of climate change. And that's just completely ridiculous. You are much less likely to die in a climate disaster now than you were in 1920 because we have better communication, we're better prepared, and as Alex Epstein has said, fossil fuels did not take a safe climate and make it dangerous. Fossil fuels have taken a dangerous climate and made it safer. He's absolutely correct on that. All right, here's another graph showing various warm periods over the last several thousand years. And here's our modern warm period on the right that we're supposed to panic about. And the first thing you should see is it's just not that hot now compared to some of these other warm periods. We had the Minoan warm period, which was warmer. The Roman warm period, you had a pretty warm peak as well. And here's the medieval warm period, which was about the same, roughly, as the current warm period. I wanted to point out that the warm periods have been optimums. And then this is fascinating that when it was cold here, not that long ago, really, in human terms, around 1600, 50,000 witches were burned. Cold times were bad times. And even back then, people thought that bad weather must be caused by people that you don't like. So people were killed on that basis. And a lot of people today think that bad weather is caused by people you don't like, but not true. Bad weather happens. Not only does bad weather happen, but warmer is better. And warmer is better for humans and for most life on Earth. All right, here's another graph showing, what I like to show on this graph is the black line. This is atmospheric CO2 over the last 550 million years. It also shows the temperature here in blue. But my major point is that for most of the last 550 million years, this black line shows that CO2 levels were thousands of parts per million CO2, like maybe 5,000 back here. As we get to the current time over here on the right, lower right, we're at more like 420 parts per million CO2. So this propaganda that the current atmosphere is filling with CO2, it's almost full, et cetera, it's just totally untrue. It's a tiny amount of CO2, even compared to the natural amounts that were there for most of the last several 100 million years. All right, this is CO2 fertilization. They took several trees here, identical trees, and grew them at various levels of CO2. And the major point here is that CO2, although it's not the climate control knob, it is excellent plant food. Over on the left, they grew a tree at 350 parts per million. It got to be this tall, and then as you see, at under 500 parts per million, it was taller, all the way up to 800 parts per million. The tree is way taller. So CO2 is excellent plant food. In greenhouses, they often inject CO2 to make the plants grow better, maybe 1,500 parts per million in a greenhouse. And so to be worried about the current 420 is just not something you should worry about. All right, this graph from the US EPA blows the whole story out of the water that heat waves are getting worse now. Heat waves in the 1930s were way worse than any heat waves we've had since then. I think this graph was embarrassing for the EPA. They had it up there for years, and just recently they demoted this graph and moved it down, and they replaced it with a graph that starts in this period here in the 60s or 70s. Because if you ignore this inconvenient data back here, you can show that, hey, heat waves have gotten worse if you start at this low point here, which is not very honest in my opinion. So if you look at more data, this is the case in almost all instances where you see an alarmist graph. If you look at all the data, the alarmism or the panic goes away. There's no reason to panic. All right, so this shows where wheat is grown in 3 provinces in Canada right now. In the green, you can see you can grow wheat in many areas up there right now. But if we were to see 1 degree centigrade of global cooling, that goes down to this area. If we saw a total of 2C of global cooling, then the area where you could grow wheat in Canada would be much smaller. And that would be a pretty big deal in terms of trying to feed our population. So global cooling would be way worse. Global cooling would be bad for us. Global warming is not bad for us. All right, and again, the propaganda might say, indicate that we have less snow in the Northern Hemisphere. So this graph shows Northern Hemisphere snow since 1980. And you can see the trend here is surprisingly a little bit upward, that we're getting more snow cover now than we were back in 1980. And again, if you just listened to the news, et cetera, you might think we're getting less snow because, of course, it's too hot for it to snow. Snow is a thing of the past, some say. Here's sea level rise. This is 20,000 years ago. As the planet started to warm, we gained about 400 feet of, the seas rose about 400 feet in about 20 centuries. That would be about 2 feet per century if at an even rate. And since 1870, seas have only risen 8 inches, or according to NASA, only 8 inches since 1870. So the seas do rise, they do fall naturally over the course of time. The whole idea that because the seas are up 8 inches since 1870, should we panic? The answer is absolutely not. And I don't know what percent of that 8 inches was even caused by humans. I'm skeptical that it was a very high percentage of that even. All right, polar bear populations. It seems like this scare is maybe going down in importance lately in terms of the propaganda importance. But here's polar bear populations around 1960. There might have been 10,000. Nobody knows exactly how many polar bears are out there at any one time. But definitely, as you get down towards modern times, the number of polar bears is way up. No question, undeniable that polar bear populations have gone up. So the whole idea that CO2 is the polar bear control knob is absolutely untrue. And we are hunting and killing, I believe, hundreds of polar bears every single year nowadays. If we were concerned about polar bears, I would think that we would cut back on hunting rather than trying to cut back on CO2, because CO2 is not the control knob anyway. All right. So you might think, as we started burning more CO2, according to the narrative, we're getting worse storms. People are dying in storms, and maybe we're not living as long because of all the terrible weather that we're getting. Anyway, that does not hold up either. Back in 1843, here's a life expectancy at birth was maybe in the maybe 40s, 30s, or something like that. And as we started to burn fossil fuels, and this is kind of around the time when the Industrial Revolution, life expectancies did not go down, they went up. So the whole idea that if you're trying to kill people by releasing small amounts of CO2, it clearly doesn't work. This experiment shows that Releasing small amounts of CO2 does not cause people to die. Same deal with poverty. The narrative is that if you release more CO2, it's going to increase poverty because of the increased storms, et cetera. But in the real world data, if you check it, since the 1985 area, we had more like 40% people in poverty. Nowadays, it's plunging more into the single digits. So CO2 is not the poverty control knob. Clearly, releasing more CO2 does not increase poverty. All right, people think that the IPCC says we're experiencing a climate crisis, but the words or the phrase climate crisis does not appear in the latest IPCC summary for policymakers. It's not in there. Back in 2012, the IPCC talked in detail about what they are seeing in the data for things like cyclones and droughts and floods. And so at the top for cyclones, low confidence in any increases in intensity, frequency, or duration. They're basically saying there's no signal that the cyclones are getting worse. Down here in the middle for droughts, same deal. Droughts are getting more intense and stronger some places. They're getting less frequent, less intense and shorter in other places. So no alarmist signal there either. Down here at the bottom for floods, the big finish is overall low confidence at the global scale regarding even the sign of the changes in floods. So there's nothing alarming. Even the IPCC admits that in these areas, there's nothing alarming going on in the data. All right, I do like this one of the deadliest tropical cyclones in history. If you look at this list, the key columns are the number of deaths here. There's been terrible in history cyclones that killed over 100K people. But if you look at the dates when those happened, here's one in 1970. Second worst one, it was in 1737. A lot of them in the 1800s. Here's one in the 1500s. Down here, the 1200s. So the whole idea that if we release more CO2, the cyclones are going to get worse and kill more people, it does not hold water at all. Right now, the climate propaganda people love to tell us that if a cyclone kills 10 or 20 people someplace, that's clearly a sign that there's a climate crisis, but it's clearly not. Cyclones are terrible and there should be zero fatalities, but bad things happen and we can't stop them by tweaking global CO2. All right, so is the world on fire? You see people at climate marches holding up signs saying that our world is on fire. Well, it is not on fire. If you look back at the global forest area burned per decade, those are the orange bars here. And you're seeing the area burned is going down, and here's the CO2 in blue going up. So if you're trying to cause fires globally, evidently emitting CO2 is not going to do it because the trends are in opposite directions. The world is not on fire. All right, here are some things I would like to say. I'm not going to read them all to you now, but if you'd like to pause them and read them on your own, go for it. I do like saying actual data is like kryptonite to climate cultists, because all you have to do is look at the real data and you will find out that nothing alarming is happening in the real data. Here's my conclusions here and some books I'd like, or some books I enjoy that maybe you would like to read on these topics. And if you have questions, please contact me on Twitter. You can direct message me. My DMs are open. Thanks.